So, this morning I talked a little bit about different types of feeds and nutrition programs needed for cow-calf. And this afternoon I'm going to talk about what kind of feeds do we have, what kind of problems have we seen over the last couple years, and what can we do for our management systems to improve that pregnancy rate on the cows and the longevity of the herd. So, first thing I'm going to chat about is water quality. There was a situation in Saskatchewan this year where they had 200 cows die on a community pasture. And it was very sudden. It was only over 2 or 3 days. When they did the water analysis, they found out that the sulfate levels were extremely high. And these cows died of polio. When you get more than 0.4% sulfur in a ration, the pH drop in the rumen is fairly significant, enough to destroy the bacteria in the rumen that produce the B vitamins, especially thiamine. And if you don't have thiamine in the diet, the brain swells, and that swelling of the brain causes them to pass away. So this can happen very quickly. So some of the levels that we want to look at and consider to be safe or not safe, or where you're going to see the problems, is total dissolved solids over 3,000 ppm. Sulfates over 2,000, and there's a caveat on that one. It also depends on what stage of production the cows are at and how hot it gets, and we'll get that into the next couple slides. Sodium, when it exceeds 300 parts per million or milligrams per liter, that supplies enough salt that you will not have cows consuming very much salt on pasture free choice. So that can be a problem. For example, anybody west of Leduc in that Thorsby, Kalmar, Drayton Valley area, sodium levels can be up to 800 ppm. And same thing along the west side of the province, the sodium levels tend to go up. So if you're having troubles with getting the cows to eat salt on the pastures, check your water quality. Iron is typically not a problem. If you're getting high nitrate levels in well water, you've got a problem with the casing and you've got leakage into the well. If it's in dugouts, basically you're feeding your cows and the manure is running into the dugout causing problems for you. In Saskatchewan, after the 200 cows died, they did a survey, or I should say farmers got really scared about water quality, and they started sending samples in for analysis. And the guys at Moose Jaw, they went ahead and started compiling all these data points. And what they found was over 50% of the water was not acceptable for use, and most of those were dugout water samples. So there's a real problem there. If we don't get any snow, or if there's very little runoff, and we get another hot summer, that water is going to evaporate. The levels of TDS and sulfates, those are just going to increase some more. So if things go against us this winter into the next summer, we could have even more problems next year. It's not only the salt or the sodium content or the sulfur content, it's what's happening with the cow. If it's a 24-degree temperature or 25-degree temperature, you can see that with the higher, oops, sorry folks, you can see with the higher temperatures, the total amount of sulfate being provided by the water goes up exponentially. So if we're looking at what is considered to be safe, if you've got a 1,400-pound cow lactating on pasture and it's only 25 degrees Celsius, they'll consume roughly 60 liters of water. If you have 0.15, 0.17 sulfur from the feed, and your maximum tolerable is 0.4 in that diet, you can see that 2,000 milligrams per liter is about the maximum that you, or 2,000 milligrams per liter is about the maximum that you can have without having troubles. If we get the hot weather and it's 30 or 34 degrees Celsius, water consumption doubles. Therefore, your 1,000 milligrams per liter is where you have to start watching out and having troubles. So monitor what's going on, watch the temperature and water quality, and act accordingly. Now, water consumption on pasture is a big deal. There's been initiatives on both provincially and federally to try to protect the riparian areas around creeks and dugouts and streams. So you fence them off and the animals can't drink out of the natural water bodies. But there's another good reason to do that. When you take water out of the dugout by pump or solar system, what happens is you get a higher quality water, lower TDS values. With less muck and manure and contamination of that water, the cows will drink more, therefore they eat more. So for example, work done at Lethbridge a number of years ago, what they found is on a 30-day program, when the cows were drinking out of the dugout as a pregnant cow, they just maintained body condition. They didn't gain any weight. In 30 days, if they drank out of a tank or a nose pump, they gained about 15 pounds. So that's half a pound a day difference in gain just for the cow. When you look at the calves, they gained an extra 20 pounds. That's a lot of money. That's $40 a calf right now. Walter Wilms did some research way back in the 90s where he looked at yearling steers on pasture. Over 71 days, they gained 44 pounds more than the animals drinking out of the dugout. There's $100 a calf. These little things that you can do that don't cost you an arm and a leg to increase your productivity, that's where you're going to make your bucks. Paying attention to the little details. The other thing that's happening right now is they've got a different, the best management practices or the code of practice by the beef producers. They had a book sent out, developed a couple of years ago. Last year, when they determined that calves, bull calves, if they're castrated over 9 months of age, they needed to have an analgesic or a pain medication applied so they don't suffer. January 1st of this year, that limitation goes down to 6 months of age. So you have to watch how old these critters are. And for those that thought, well, I'm going to leave my bulls intact, the testicles between the legs will produce the hormones and get these calves to grow faster. That occurs after puberty at 10, 11 months of age. You're not going to be castrating, or a lot of these calves will be gone to market, or you're going to be castrating before that time, so you might as well do it earlier rather than later. And there's an effect on the calf age and castrations, or the stress from castration. This is work that they did in the States a couple years back. But what they found is for the first 30 days after castration, these animals don't eat as much. They're under stress. So what they found is it's a sigmoid curve, and the larger the animal or the older the animal, the larger the reduction in growth rate. So for example, if you're castrating at roughly 7 to 8 months of age, you're going to be losing roughly 0.3 of a kilogram, or just over half a pound a day gain on those calves for 30 days. And they don't gain it back. That opportunity is lost. So there's another $30 per calf. So where are we at? $80 for water, $15 for castration. There's $100 right there. It's money in your pocket. Yes, sir.
Are you talking cutting for castration, or banding?
Either or, it doesn't matter. The younger you can do it, the less pain, the less problems you're going to have with those calves, and less loss of gain or productivity. I fixed this thing last night, and something happened. My slides are a little bit wonky, but I'll just keep on going. The other option you have with feeds and productivity when you're facing a situation where you've got lower productivity on the pastures and the pasture quality is going down is creep feed the calves. Calves can handle grain at roughly 45 to 50 days of age. So if you're calving out in April, by the middle of June, you can throw a creep feeder out in the pasture, and the calves will do very well. Calves under 700 pounds don't need to have grain processed. They take a long time to chew and eat their ration. So they'll break the kernels and you don't have to process it. Think of it as a 4-year-old kid at a kitchen table. Once they get over 700 pounds, it's like the people in the front row here. How long does it take you to eat supper when you're in a hurry? 3 minutes? Maybe 4? It's gobble and go. Once they get over 700 pounds, you got Electrolux, Filter Queen, and Craftsman or whoever else you want for your third vacuum system. But after they get over 700 pounds, they don't chew well and they lose digestive efficiency. What you want is a high energy, high protein feed. So an easy ration for a creep feeder at home, 1/3 oats, 1/3 barley, and 1/3 peas, and that'll give you a beautiful 16% creep ration. Good for those 300-400 weight calves. They'll do very, very well on it. In 2002, there was a herd I was working with that put a creep feeder out. He had 2 different herds, same genetics. One pasture was on one site where he put the creep feeder on, and the other side he did not because he only had one feeder available. There was 150 pounds differential on his weaning weights. That was in a dry year. Other component on this is when you have the creep feeder out there, these calves learn how to eat grain. So when they're weaned, you're reducing the stress at weaning, and some of the work has shown that you can have up to 90% less illness or sickness on the calves because they know what grain is, they can eat it, and the transition is very simple. So even in a good year, you will get a response on the creep feed. There's a couple of people that I'm working with. They are finding that they are averaging just under 3 pounds a day gain on their calves on pasture when they put the creep feeder out. That's huge. Ergot and mycotoxins, some of the problems that we've had over the last couple of years. It's a problem caused by cool, cloudy, wet conditions. The spores germinate, or excuse me, the ergot bodies germinate, producing spores, releasing spores, and they infect the open pollinated crops, barley, wheat, oats. You can get it in rye, you can get it in brome grass, timothy. So it's not just the cereals, it can occur in the grasses in the ditches as well, or on the pasture. Long-term effects: feed refusal, digestive upsets, pneumonia-like symptoms, shipping fever, hoof problems, digestive upsets, and death. So they were wondering a while back what would happen, or when do these toxins occur? This is what they call the honeydew stage, where the infection occurs, the seed starts to develop, and it exposes a drop of liquid that looks like honey. The toxins are there at that point in time. So if you want to prevent any problems with ergot on a year or toxicity, you need to cut it before those plants are pollinated. There's 40 different types of alkaloids in the ergot bodies. You can get them tested. They test for 7 different types at Prairie Diagnostic Services in Saskatoon at the vet lab. $63 for the test. It's probably the cheapest place you can go. They do excellent work. They'll give you a report. What we're finding is with the types of alkaloids present in the ergot bodies in Western Canada, those levels are 2.5 to 3 times higher than the literature that we've been reading out of Texas, Oklahoma, and out of the States for the last 20 years. So it's a bigger problem than what we thought. Tolerances can vary from animal to animal. For bulls, it'll affect sperm motility. The estrogen content in these alkaloids can cause temporary sterility in the heifers, basically putting them on birth control pills so they will not cycle or conceive a calf. And at high temperatures, what will happen is, what these ergot alkaloids do is they prevent blood flow to go towards the outside of the body. So in the wintertime, what happens is you'll see frozen ears, frozen tails, loss of hair on the tail. That restriction of blood flow to the outside also occurs in the summertime, but basically what you're doing is you're putting that animal into an oven and they can't get rid of that excess heat. So they're under heat stress. Rates of gain will drop, and they could potentially die as well. There's two types of ergot poisoning. One is nervous ergotism, which typically does not occur in cattle. The one that we have to worry about is the gangrenous form, and we've seen this. It'll take about 4 to 6 weeks before the animals show symptoms, such as, you can see the problem with the hooves where they're just sloughing off, and that'll never repair itself. That animal has to be put down. So basically, once you have the problem, what do? The old standards that we had from the Canadian Foods Act, or Canadian Food Inspection Agency, they said no more than 0.1%, or basically 1 kernel in 1,000. With these new test results out of Saskatchewan, that's completely out the window. If I had to make a guess, it would probably be 1 kernel in a 5-gallon pail or a 20-liter pail. That's probably where your limits are now. The first thing that you'll see when you have an ergot problem, and this is very typical if you're getting a screenings pellet, is you'll take the new type of feed home and they'll have a reduction in feed intake. They'll just go off feed within the first couple days. If you persist and try to keep on feeding them, then they'll start producing the pneumonia type symptoms, the shipping fever symptoms, and if they back off feed, they seem to be getting better, and then they'll feel better, start eating more. You got that problem. So if you see the feed refusal, that's a red flag for me. Get the feed sampled and get it off the feed truck and use something different. So they're talking about reduced milk production at 100 parts per billion at the U of S. The milk flow in the milk vein is reduced. And the other side of the coin is, how prevalent is the problem? The toxicity on these alkaloids are maintained over a number of years, so if you've got an old bin of barley that's 10 or 15 years old with ergot in it, you're going to still have the same problems if it's no different than thrashing it this fall and feeding it this winter. Ergocysteine is the main alkaloid causing problems. Okay, it's a fancy name, but it's one of the alkaloids, and when the damage does occur, it's irreversible. So in 2014, 964 samples were submitted. Over half had 200 parts per billion, or parts per million. In 2015, they were still doing the analysis when I did this slide, and they were at about 40%. So in the wet years, you've got to be really careful with this. Now, some of the other problems that we're running into in the wet conditions is molds and mycotoxins. So Fusarium is spreading throughout many parts of the province. It started off in southern Alberta. It's now in this area. It's going further north. It's something that I think we're going to have to live with. There's no way to eradicate it right now. So basically, Fusarium is a pinkish white mold. It's one of the most common types of toxins, reduces protein synthesis in the animal. For pigs and chickens, they're extremely sensitive to this, so basically they've got no tolerance whatsoever. And for yearling heifers, 37 parts per million. So that's not much. It won't take much to affect their reproductive capability. Two of the mycotoxins formed within the Fusarium cluster is the HT2 and the T2 toxins. They ruin the guts in the animals. The epithelium in the rumen is destroyed, and what that does over the long term is it makes that animal incapable of absorbing the nutrients efficiently. So you might be feeding a great ration, but they won't gain the weight. It'll take a lot longer to get them to market. So it also causes a suppression of bone marrow development, so white blood cells will be reduced for production, impaired immunity, reproductive efficiency goes down, damages the nervous system, and skin disorders. So if you've ever seen a cow that's got hypersensitivity or photosensitivity, I should say, where they've got, looks like sunburn around the eyes, around the udder, that's what you're going to see with this mycotoxins. Feed refusal is one of the first symptoms of this complex as well. So for the HT2, 100 parts per billion is the limit, and 1,000 for the T2. And these compounds will be tested at the Prairie Diagnostic Services if you find you've got a problem. Aspergillus, it's a white mold that can be found on heated or tough grain, or if you've turned hay a couple, 3 times and you bale it up a little bit tough, you'll have a white mold in the bale. This is more of a nuisance than anything else, but it's a naturally occurring bacteria that is in the soil. So if you're raking your hay and you got the wheel set a little bit too far down and you're scratching the dirt and the dust is going into the swath, you bale it up a little bit tough, you're going to have the white mold. Penicillium, a green or blue mold, can form on grains, not only corns. Abortions, retained placentas, and reduced fertility. So this will definitely hurt the female side of the equation.
Do you get that in silage too?
It is possible. Dr. Mark, what are your thoughts on getting it in silage?
Probably not as much as the orange stuff we see, the highly pigmented molds, DOM. I hear about it once in a while.
Because we get a white mold, white and green mold on the silage bale.
Green would be more likely, so that's for sure.
Yeah. So if we start looking at the quality and digestibility of 2-year-old hay, what we know is you've got hay that sits out in the field for a year, or you've got it stacked for a year. What you're going to do is have a reduction in protein availability, lower protein content. The bales will be any place from 100 to 200 pounds lighter compared to the year before, and you're going to have probably a 10% reduction in forage digestibility. So 2-year-old hay, if you can buy it for half price and get it retested, it might be a good deal. But if you're needing to buy it at the same cost as what normal hay is, forget it. If the fellow that you're buying from says, well, my bales weighed 1,400 pounds last year, guess what? Run it over the scale. They'll probably be 1,200 pounds when you buy it. It'll make a big difference in what you have to pay if you've negotiated a price on a per pound basis. So let's look at what happens when you actually make the hay and you get rain at different times of curing. With no rain, just because you're putting it through a crimper, through the baler, through the teeth, and in through the belts, you're probably going to have about 10% of that material breaking off and landing on the ground. The material that is receiving 2 inches of rain during curing, and you got to break this one down a little bit, because what happens is the cell structures or the cell walls on the plant material, if it's greater than 40%, it stays intact. Those walls do not rupture. So the chances of losing soluble protein and soluble carbohydrate out of those cells is much less. If the rain comes when the hay is closer to baling, within a day or two of baling, and it's at 20 or 25%, that's when you're going to lose a lot of the nutrients. So 2 inches during curing, you're losing 44% of the bale or the dry matter content in that field. If you get 3 inches on hay that is within a day or two of being baled, you could lose more than half of the crop. The dry matter yield is going to be that much less. Storage of the hay, makes a big difference. If you have a, let's say we're working with a 5-pound bale, the green line, and you've got 4 inches of spoilage, 22% of that bale weight is going to be affected by weather damage. That's going to reduce digestibility. It's going to reduce the quality of that hay. They won't eat as much. So for example, that 4 inches of spoilage could be 300 pounds of weight that'll be affected. And when we were at the Lethbridge meeting, we were talking with a fellow about silage, and he was asking, okay, I've got that black layer that's across the top and around the edges of the silage pit. And what they'd do is they'd put it off to the side, not feed it to the dairy cows, but they'd take it out for the beef cows as part of their ration. 5% of the ration with that black material reduces digestibility of the entire ration by 10%. So if you've got that black stuff on the silage pit, scrape it off, put it off to the side. When the fields are dry enough in the spring, load it up onto the manure wagon and haul it out as green manure. You don't want to feed it to the cows. Bale loss over winter, work done by Rob Hand back in the late 80s, early 90s. They found that shrinkage would account for about 5.7%. So 1,450 pound bale, that was 82 pounds. So I'm trying to show that you need to do something to protect these bales from the weather, to optimize the use of that forage, especially if you've got carryover. Weather impact, hay that's been left outdoors without any protection from the weather. The big impact, you can see that the protein levels are reasonable. They're good quality hays. Fiber levels are where I'd like to see them. Not much for heat damage or unavailable crude protein, but the in vitro dry matter digestibility drops from 62% down to 55%. That's a 7% drop. That's a lot. When you look at some of the barley cultivars now that are being used for silage, the difference between CDC Austenson and something like Vivre or Xena, it's a 2% increase in digestibility with the Austenson. And guys are gobbling it up and saying, I want that product because I'm going to get that much more out of my dairy cows or out of my beef cows or my feedlot because the efficiency is that much higher. Other side of the coin is when you have hay out in the field or in the hay yard, you're going to lose dry matter content, or dry matter recovery will go down because of damage to the outside of the bale. So for example, the alfalfa grass hay, dry matter recovery a half a year after the bales were made is only 78%. Straight grass hay, 93%. So the alfalfa is where you're losing the dry matter content, and a lot of that is the protein and the soluble carbohydrates. Now, how you go ahead and stack the bales makes a big difference as well. If you're stacking the bales in a pyramid where you're starting with 4, 3, 2, 1, that's probably the worst way that you can store your hay, because the moisture comes off the top bale, goes into the second row, into the third row, and any place those bales touch, that's where you're going to get the damage. If you're looking at a mushroom stack where the first bale is laid flat and the second bale on top of it, your top bale is going to do fairly well, but that bottom bale is going to be wicking up a lot of moisture from the bottom and getting all the moisture off the top. The best way to stack the bales is not to stack them. Leave them in single rows. Leave 6 to 10 inches space between the bales so they're not touching. That's the best way to minimize your losses and damage on that crop. Twine versus net wrap. Net wrap will help shed the water off the bales. A high density bale or a very heavy bale versus a loose bale helps shed the water as well. So if you're using a net wrap, it's going to definitely improve the long-term storability of the hay. Plastic covers, they can be as effective as a shed as long as the plastic remains in place where you want it and you're not getting a bunch of animal damage, be it skunks or raccoons or magpies, or coyotes, whatever it is. As long as that integrity is there, it'll protect the, will protect the stack. Now the big thing is some people go ahead and close off both ends of the stack with the plastic. What that does is basically makes that stack into an oven. As the temperatures change, moisture migrates out of the bales, it'll condense on the plastic, on the inside of the plastic. Whenever that plastic touches the bale, that's where you're going to have spoilage. So make your bale stacks, if you're using a plastic cover, if you've got prevailing winds from northwest to southeast, make your stacks in the same direction so the wind can get under that plastic on the ends and push the air out the other side. Some people have gone to the point of putting in a 2x6 or a piece of wood between the bale and the plastic so that there is an inch or so of room between the bales and the plastic so that moisture can evaporate or be carried out by the wind. Problem there is if that plastic starts flapping, you're going to have a tear and the plastic cover is gone. So there's a balancing act that you have to have. The only thing I don't like about plastic covers, what do you do with the plastic otherwise after you're done? How do you dispose of it? What do you do with that? Do you take it to the landfill or do you just take it out to the back corner of the field and burn it? That's the big problem I have with that. Feed refusal. When you look at storage techniques and compare inside storage versus hay that's stored outside unprotected from the weather, the big number that I'm looking at is feed refusal or feed waste is 33% for bales that are left uncovered outside, and only 15.5% loss in dry matter or waste with the bales from the inside. So instead of throwing one bale and 3 on a pile and lighting a match to it, you can reduce that to 1 bale and 8 by having them under protection. Feed intake is reduced when hay is stored outside. On average for a beef cow, you'll lose about ½ a pound a day feed intake for hay that's not stored protected. And if you go ahead and take a bale processor or a bale buster or a hay shredder where they make a big pile of hay and you let it store for 2 months before you feed it out, feed intake can be down by 3 to 4 pounds a day. We went over the digestibility already. Storage losses, I'm going to just recover that again. The pyramids are the worst. Mushroom stacks are second choice, but the best way is to leave the bales not touching. I'm going to get into another realm of animal production and the utilization of feed. And John was talking about having the animals in good condition. How do you manage these animals to optimize the reproductive efficiency? And that's the use of the body condition scoring system. It's a manual evaluation of the animals where the simplest component in that is if you have the 4 short ribs, and what you always do is work on the right side of the animal when you're looking from the back, and what you're doing is evaluating the amount of tissue or fat covering the 4 short ribs. If the short ribs, when you use your finger or thumb, is very sharp to the touch, that animal is not carrying much fat. They're under condition. If you have a hard time pressing your fingers and feeling the bones, you're feeding them too much and it's costing you money. So use the body condition scoring system as a way to manage your feed supply and also impact your reproductive capability of the animals. So if I'm looking at an animal, you'll probably see a difference with the naked eye in midwinter when the cow loses about 200 pounds or 1 body condition score. The first thing that you'll see is when you lose 200 pounds of weight, these cows are getting skinny. They can't withstand the cold. So just to keep these cows in current condition and warm, it's going to take about 1,400 pounds of hay. Hay's running what? 6 cents a pound, roughly right now? Is that a good estimate? Come on, you economic guys. Where's hay at? No idea? Let's assume it's 6 cents a pound. That's $85 a cow for the winter. Additional feed costs that you don't need to have. It doesn't only affect how much heat these cows lose, it also affects the ability of that cow to produce colostrum and the quality of the colostrum that's being produced. Now, Dr. Engstrom talked about the importance of colostrum this morning, providing the antibodies and the need for good levels of vitamin E. So, if you've got a cow that's thin, what's going to happen, and this is the US scoring system from 1 to 9. If you want to use it under the Canadian system, just break that in half. So the 6 is roughly a body condition score of 3, and that's where you want your animals at, going into winter, or that's the minimum for calving. So what you have is 2 types of immunoglobulins. One, IgM, which is the short-term immunity. Right after the calf is born, if you've got problems with scours, pneumonias, other things that are 2, 3, 5 days after the calf is born, could partially be caused by the shortage of this short-term immunity. And you can see that a cow that's body condition score 1.5 Canadian system, you've got half of the short-term immunity available. That passive immunity is not going to the calf. For the IgG, or long-term immunity, you can see that there's still about a 25% reduction in passive immunity passed on to the calf. So more feed costs, more illnesses coming into the calf. So we're not looking good. This is starting to pile up, and see that we're going to have more troubles if we got thin cows going into winter. And unfortunately, as I'm driving around this fall with the poor quality pastures and guys being laid up with harvest and not paying attention to their cows, there's a number of thin cows throughout the province right now. It affects the immunity, affects the colostrum content. It'll also impact the amount of milk that the cows are going to be able to eat. The red line indicates when the cow will maximize feed intake, which is roughly 12 weeks after calving. Maximum milk production occurs 8 weeks after calving. So when you're wanting to maximize your milk production, you're never getting enough groceries into those cows, so they need additional support from their bodies to supply the energy. And what they do is they mobilize the fat off their back. So if they're skinny, they can't get that peak lactation. So if they are able to produce or mobilize 1 pound of fat, that'll produce enough energy to produce 7 pounds of milk. Now, let's say this cow cannot take the meat or the fat off her back to produce the milk, and your peak lactation isn't at 14 or 18 pounds, but rather at 12 or 11, that 3 pounds reduction in milk production continues on for that 200 days that the lactation occurs. So you don't get the recovery afterwards. If you don't hit the peak, you've lost it for that lactation. So how do we get around this? Energy supplementation. Feeding them extra grain or some way to give them higher quality forage and feed for the last 90 days pre-calving. So why is that important? If you don't have animals that are being fed properly, and for example, feeding levels on a high energy level or a low energy level for the last 90 days pre-calving, you can see that for the cows and heifers under the high plane of nutrition, there's basically no difference in body weight, and 5% assist rate on the heifers, I can live with that. It's not great, but I'll live with it. Now, when they don't supplement the extra energy to these cows for the last 90 days, you can see that the calf weight goes down considerably, by 10 or 12 pounds, but this is where I find it unacceptable. 60% of the calves born needed to be helped, the assistance rate. And always when you have the assistance rate, there's something else going on behind the scenes. That calf is compromised for the length of its life. They can't do as well. The other thing that happens with these animals that are not being supplemented extra grain to get their weights up to where they need to be or have that extra energy, You can see that it's taking roughly 20 days longer for these animals to start cycling. So instead of catching them on the first cycle, they'll be getting pregnant on the second cycle if they do. You've got a 20% reduction in pregnancy rate on those sin animals even after they start cycling. Now this work was done in 1978 by Bellows and Short. There's more recent information from 2014 doing the same thing, and they're getting the same results. So even though this is old data, the same thing's happening now. But the complicating factor, like John said, is we're not having a 60 or a 90-day breeding season. We're down to 35 to 40 days. So that's going to compound that problem even more. To reinforce that, if you can get the cow to cycle prior to the bull being turned in, if they can cycle once before their bull's turned in, your first service conception rate goes up by about 20%. So you can see that the thin cows, even 90 days after calving, only 2/3 of them were cycling. The good condition cows, 91% were cycling 60 days after calving, and 100% by the time the bull was turned out. So that dramatically increases the size of the calf by the time weaning comes along, and how many cows do you have to sell in the fall because they were open. Work done at the University of Alberta back in the 60s by Dr. Berg and McElroy. They quantified how severe the weight loss is and the impact on reproduction. The animals had lost 125 pounds. They had an 80% calf crop that year, only a 65% the year after. When they actually got the next year, when they fed them a little bit better and they gained a little bit of weight between calving and breeding season, 90% calf crop. So they were in good shape getting to that point, but the next year they were also getting a high level of reproductive efficiency. So paying attention to their body condition score and giving them a little bit of extra TLC definitely pays in the long run. Even if you feed a herd of cows 110% of requirements, someplace between 20 and 30% of those cows will be thin or less than optimum body condition because you've got competition. The strong cows, the aggressive cows, they'll get the better part of the feed. Those that get pushed away, they'll get the dregs, or they have to eat a bunch of straw. So they're not going to do as well. So if you have a bunch of thin cows, split them out. If you have to, and if you don't have another pen, put them in with the replacement heifers. They get a higher quality ration, less competition, get them into shape, and they'll do better the following year. Duplication here, but basically beef herd management binder, and I think John was the guy that wrote part of this paper at that point in time when he was young and foolish. Losing condition after calving, losing that 100 pound or 200 pounds after calving, they were all open. Maintaining condition and body condition score 2, 40% loss in reproductive efficiency. And if you can manage to get those cows to gain weight, even though they're thin at calving, if they can gain weight before the bulls are put out, you can still have a 15% loss. But feeding management plays a big part in this. So how does body management, body score management influence what you're doing? Build the cows up when the feed is short or cheap. So this fall, for example, in the area of southern Alberta, we're telling them, wean these calves now. If you have to background them on the farm for the next 30 or 40 days until you want to sell them, put them on a hay ration, they'll do, or a grain silage ration, they'll do just fine on that. But you're giving that cow an opportunity to gain weight. A dry cow has a 25% lower nutrient requirement than a lactating cow. Build her up, get the weight on her before it gets cold. If you need to supply extra energy on pasture or on stubble fields, skip a day feeding. Put 4 or 5 pounds of grain out to those cows every second or third day. Get the energy levels up, get their protein levels up. And the big thing is, monitor the condition of the cows. If you've got a snowstorm or a bad stretch of weather for a week or 10 days, if those cows have dropped 40, 50 pounds, you need to fix that problem quickly. Don't let them stay thin, because that's just going to compound that problem. So, what I'm saying is you've got two options. Either you pay attention to the details now and spend a little bit of money to fix the problem, or if you ignore it, it's going to cost you a lot more later on. Robbing Peter to pay Paul only increases the problems later on. And with that, any questions? I'm going to stop there.